I'm Cindy Condon.
And I'm Jan Margosian. Welcome to Legislative Matters. Tune in and take part. A segment of Willamette Wake Up on KMUZ Community Radio. Each week for the last 19 weeks, we have provided our listeners with an unbiased look at a variety of bills moving their way through the legislative system and those who move them. Our purpose is to inform and inspire citizen engagement in the legislative process. Today, our last program for the summer will feature an interview with Steve Buckstein of the Cascade Policy Institute, conducted by Cindy. But before we welcome Steve, I'd like to take a quick look at last week's bills signed by the governor. Now, the governor just keeps on signing, although the rest of the players have taken off. And she signed 10 last week, and we'll get to as many as we can before we get into our interview here. House Bill 5029, these are bills she signed last week, 10th through the 14th of July. It just gives money from the general fund to the State Board of Parole and post-prison supervision. And we'll see a lot of these, Cindy. They just, they've got to sign it so that they can get some money out of the general fund. House Bill 2845, it directs the Department of Education to convene advisory group to develop statewide ethnic studies standards for adoption into existing statewide social studies standards from kindergarten through grade 12. So that's, I thought, good thing. House Bill 3267 directs school districts and public charter schools, we watched this before, to waive high school diploma requirements that are not established by state law if a student is or was a foster child, homeless, runaway, child in military family, child of migrant worker, or enrolled in the Youth Corrections Education Program or Juvenile Detention Education Program. That goes into effect next January 1, 2018. Now, House Bill 3047, I kept reading it. This is drones we're talking about. So to help everybody understand.
And not bees.
Yeah, it allows law enforcement agency to use unmanned aircraft system for purpose of reconstruction of accident scene, which I think, it's another way of looking at things, give you more information, provides that person may not operate unmanned aircraft system, drones, over privately owned premises in a manner so as to harass or annoy owner or occupant of premises. I knew you'd like that, Cindy.
Yes.
Creates exception, though, because it allows law enforcement unmanned aircraft system capable of firing bullet or projectile in certain circumstances. Declares an emergency.
Wow.
Effective June 29th. So it still allows that to happen with law enforcement. House Bill 2360 modifies a reporting obligation for sex offenders by requiring report within 10 days following a change of residence. Now, before it said the requirement was that you have to have a new residence before this obligation is triggered. Now it doesn't matter. You have to report even if you don't have a new residence. If you don't, they'd be out there just wandering around and you wouldn't know what they were doing. So I think that's it sunsets January 1st, 2022. So they're seeing if it works. Effective June 22nd of this year. House Bill 3242 requires a peace officer to electronically record custodial interview with person under 18 years of age. We talked about this before. When investigating a felony or allegation that person under 18 years of age committed act that, if committed by adult, would constitute a felony. So that's just a few.
Good. I like the use of peace officer. I think we should refer to peace officers.
That's a good name, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So any more? Any more bills by the governor?
Yes, there are a couple more.
And we can come back to that later.
Okay.
We can get to, okay. I think we've got Steve on the phone. Steve, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Cindy Condon, and I'm pleased to introduce and interview our special guest today, which Steve Buckstein, who is founder and senior policy analyst for the Cascade Policy Institute. Steve helped found the Cascade Policy Institute in January 1991 and served as its president until 2004. As senior policy analyst, he writes and speaks both in Oregon and nationally on several policy areas, including tax and budget issues, healthcare reform, education reform, which we'll speak a lot to today, and Social Security reform. Prior to founding Cascade, Steve coordinated the 1990 general election campaign for a citizens initiative, which would have provided educational tax credits to every student in Oregon so they could choose public, private, religious, or homeschooling. Steve served on the board of Oregonians for Cost-Effective Government in 1987 and 1988 and was a 1988 candidate for Oregon State Treasurer. So thank you, Steve, for joining us this morning.
Glad to be here.
We're glad the stars aligned and to make some time in your schedule. I know it's a busy time of year, but hopefully it's settling down a little bit after session.
Yes, once the legislature is not in session, we can rest a little easier.
Indeed, all of us, I think. So before we get started on some of the specifics from the legislative session, can you tell us a little bit more about the Cascade Policy Institute, the work you do, how you're funded, just some background?
Sure. Cascade Policy Institute, we bill ourselves as Oregon's free market think tank. Our mission is to promote public policies that improve individual liberty, personal responsibility, and economic opportunity in Oregon. And we were founded in 1991, as you mentioned. We are funded totally privately by individuals, companies, and foundations. We take no government funding. And we do not, we're a nonprofit, so we do not support or oppose any partisan candidates. We won't tell you or your listeners to vote for or against anyone for governor, for example, or for a legislator. We will tell you, we're happy to tell you that we think some of their ideas are good or bad, depending on the situation. And frankly, we find some good ideas and bad ideas in just about every elected official in the state. We are not really a conservative organization. I know you mentioned that we sort of had a more conservative approach. We do fiscally, but socially we are more tolerant or liberal or libertarian. For example, one of the bills that we could talk about if you want to is the one that reduced punishment for possession of small amounts of heroin, cocaine, and other drugs. Our conservative friends would be very much against that. We are for that approach. We think that the war on drugs is a huge failure, and we would like to see other approaches to help people instead of locking them up in jail.
Good, and we do want to talk a little bit more about that. And I'm sorry for using the term conservative, because I know you certainly look at the issues and have a perspective, but whether that's conservative, I'm not even sure what conservative or liberal means anymore, to tell you the truth. So
it's almost hard to tell these days.
Absolutely. So given that the session has just recently ended, but you've had about a week to kind of debrief and assess for yourselves, can you start us off with just your assessment of the session, how it worked or didn't work for Oregonians from your perspective?
Well, again, there's no one conclusion, but I would say, we started off at the beginning of the session with the governor saying we had something like a $1.8 billion deficit that would have to be filled some way, even though we were looking at that point of something like $1.5 billion in more revenue, record revenue coming into the state. But for some reason, she didn't see how they could balance their budget without even more revenue and or cost cutting. And the majority in the House and Senate tried hard to increase taxes dramatically with, in effect, a gross receipts tax, a smaller one than voters soundly rejected last year in Measure 97, but still a major increase in taxation, and we opposed that. We thought that was not a good approach. We ended up without any new major taxes, although one of the ugly bills that I'll mention is going to raise taxes or could raise taxes by $550 to $600 million on our health care. But there wasn't the big general tax increase that people were looking for. When it ended up, the general fund and lottery budget in the next biennium, the budget that the legislature passed, and I assume the governor is going to sign if she hasn't already, is up by 10.3% from the last biennium. That's a pretty big increase. And again, most of that is because the economy's been doing better, and so revenue has been coming into the state to the extent that the budget, again, is up by about 10.3%, the general fund budget from the last biennium. So I'm not sure if that's good or bad. The fiscal analysts say that that's below what's needed to maintain quote-unquote current service levels. But one of the bills the legislature passed hopefully is going to end that practice, at least look at it and say we're not just going to automatically start out and say any agency gets the money they got last time plus what it takes to maintain services. We're going to take a fresh look at this and see if there are ways we can hold down costs in government, and I think that's a good idea.
Well, and there was some movement, or certainly some words stated by the governor about their hard work in taking a look at the expense side of the equation, without a whole lot of specifics. There are no new hires, not filling old position or vacant positions. So as you look at the expense side and the look at what the legislature has done to control expenses versus the revenue side.
Some of those are good things. One of the best things in that bill that I don't think anybody was even looking at until the last couple of weeks of the session, at least I wasn't aware of it, was that in that cost containment bill is a prohibition on double health care coverage for state workers. There are state workers who are in a household where they get government-provided health insurance as part of their benefit package, but their spouse or someone living with them also gets state or government-funded health care because they're a state worker or a local government worker or a school district worker or whatever. And that is costing Oregonians apparently something like $94 million a biennium. So the legislature, with, it seemed to me, very little discussion, once they realized that was happening, they voted to prohibit that. So you can take the better of the two packages, but you can't have them both.
And so do you see certainly more focus on the expense side, given what happened with Measure 97 and no action really in the legislature other than the healthcare fee or taxes going up? Just a more focused view of the expense side from both sides of the aisle?
But again, it seemed to come late in the session. It seemed like, in fact, the majority in both houses, the public employee unions, the governor seemed to be saying up until the very end that they wouldn't even look at controlling costs unless they got a major new tax increase. And when it became obvious, actually earlier in the session, I guess, that they didn't have the votes to get a major new tax increase because it takes a 3/5 supermajority in both houses to pass a revenue tax increase. They backed off that, it seemed like, and they did look at some significant cost containment. They didn't do anything from our standpoint, which we're disappointed about, to control PERS costs or to meet the PERS crisis that's really barreling in on us. But one of the things they did do in that cost containment bill that I think Oregonians are going to find very interesting is they required, right now we all think of what's called the unfunded actuarial liability of the PERS system as something like $22 billion. We have $22 billion less in the kitty than we are going to need to pay out all the benefits we promised public employees. That is only if they meet their current projected earnings of about 7.5 or 7 3/4. And the last 10 years, the PERS account has only earned 5.5. So that unfunded liability is really higher. And the legislature voted in that cost containment bill to require that the unfunded liability include what are called employer side accounts, which we seem to forget about. The state and local governments have borrowed billions of dollars against their PERS liability because when interest rates were low, they figured they could do that and invest the money at higher rates. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But that gets off the PERS books. And the state itself has something like $6 billion in those side accounts. So even right there, the actuarial liability, I think, will be going up from $22 billion to $28 billion. Doesn't change what's actually happening, but it changes our perception of how bad the problem is.
Yeah, and at some point, it seems to us that PERS will have to be dealt with.
Yes.
Yeah.
Steve,
Yeah.
you just put
And again,
Cindy
the union
into
says
shock.
we won't talk about it unless we get a major tax increase, and so it really wasn't talked about.
Yeah, it seems like there was a lot of crosstalk during the session. I did attend a hearing, an informational hearing on PERS that was quite interesting, and at the time we covered it, and certainly encouraged people to go listen to those hearings because it does make the picture pretty clear with respect to PERS and the unfunded liabilities, I should say, related to it. So, and I think most of us in the state of Oregon either are related to someone covered by PERS or know people that are covered by PERS, and so we know how personal it is, but it's certainly a looming cloud out there.
Right, and it's going to be eating up larger and larger shares of government agency budgets, especially school districts.
Yeah, is it projected
40% of your employment costs go to teachers who are no longer teaching, through the PERS system? That's going to be a major problem.
I'm sorry, what was that percentage?
It could be going up as high as 40%. It's ratcheted. They ratchet it. They try to smooth out the increases, but if nothing's done in the next few years, we could see 40% going towards PERS.
Interesting.
To meet current and past obligations.
Interesting. Well, we could go on that for a very long time, but I don't want to. I don't want to leave you this morning without talking about Senate Bill 437, which is the Educational Savings Account bill. And I know you were very, very active with respect to it, and certainly have concerns about the Oregon's education system in general. And you're not alone. And so, could you just give some background on Educational Savings Account, where it was left in the legislature, where you think it might go?
Sure. There are 5 states right now that, in fact, actually, I think there may be a couple others that passed bills in their recent legislative sessions, but currently 5 states. It started with Arizona in, I think, 2011, these are basically the smartphones of the school choice movement, the old voucher plans that everybody hears about and some people like and some people don't, are the rotary telephones of the school choice world. Education savings accounts allow families to take a portion of the money that the state would allocate to their local school district, their local public school district, and spend it in other ways than going to the local public school. They could pay for private school tuition, they could pay for tutoring, they could pay for online classes, older kids could pay for community college courses, and it puts some discipline. We were talking just a minute ago about cost savings. It puts some discipline in the public education system funding or spending process, because if you don't spend all the money in your account, it rolls over to future years, even into college. And so a private school can't come to you and say, well, gee, the state has given you $5,000. We're going to charge you $5,000. It doesn't work that way with ESAs. If you find an equivalent education for $4,500, you get to save the other $500, and that can add up over a number of years. So we see this as a way to put control of education back into parents' hands. One of the huge issues in the legislature was funding K through 12 education, the K through 12 budget, and a lot of people were disappointed that they only funded it at $8.2 billion from the state. That's not all that's spent on education. The local governments and federal governments put in more money, but even before that 8.2, which is about 10 or 11% more than the current biennium, Oregon is spending more than 33 other states on K through 12 education per child. And that's not our number. That's not Cascade Policy Institute's number. That's the National Education Association's number, calculated two different ways of looking at student populations. They say that we are number 33 before this 11% increase. So we don't believe that money is the problem in education. We believe lack of choice, and the fact that local school districts basically have a captive audience in many of their students, and so they get paid whether the kids learn or not. With an ESA, it would be a better opportunity for kids to get a better education without spending any more money.
So I understand, I think, what you're saying in terms of more money is not going to solve the issue, but nobody that we've heard, and we've had a couple of interviews on the program where we've just certainly talked about education, has talked about the management piece of it. One of the things that in preparing for the program today, I was thinking about was how government-funded loans or guaranteed student loans have been used in the higher ed market, and certainly we've seen some problems with respect to private schools and the use of those funds in higher ed. And I have some concerns about that happening in K through 12. Once there's public funding available, and
you do have to audit the accounts. You can't just let people go off and buy something from a charlatan. You're right, but the ASA accounts in other states, we would look at doing it the same way. The accounts are audited. You can only spend it at approved providers. And so, again, it's hard to imagine that we could have a much worse system than we have now with some of our failing schools. Jefferson High School in Portland is a great example. For decades, it's been spending more money than other public schools in Portland, and kids are not learning to read and write. I mean, there are more families in the Jefferson catchment area, as it's called, who are figured out a way to send their kids to other schools than actually still go to Jefferson. And
yeah.
They just all they do is spend more money per child. And if that was a private institution, they'd be probably brought up on fraud charges by now.
So I'm just curious, with respect to, as the Cascade Policy Institute and you specifically have thought about education, are there other avenues to improvement? And I understand the education savings accounts would be a vehicle, but for instance, if there were free transfer of students within a school district, so that students migrate to the best publicly funded school in the school district, are other avenues likely to succeed, or
They can, and Portland is, to its credit, Portland Public School District, the biggest in the state, has had up until recently a fairly open transfer process within its system, but the pressures are always to shut that down. Now the argument in Portland is, well, we're harming our neighborhood schools. If the kids who live 2 blocks away get to go to a school that's a mile away, what does that do to that brick building that's sitting there, across the street from them? And from our standpoint, we don't care about the brick buildings. We care about the kids and where they get a good education. So the teachers union, for example, is always pushing back against open enrollment. And there's been open enrollment on the state level to some degree, but as long as you limit it to the public school system, the public school system gets the money wherever the kids go. So and from our view, you have to open it up to outside providers.
Interesting. Well, before we break in about 3 minutes, I would like you to talk a little bit about, I hate to leave education, but I want you to talk a little bit about the healthcare tax bill. And I know, I believe you were opposed to it.
Yes.
And
that's one of the ugly bills that you said we should talk about, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yes.
Yeah, let's talk about this one before we take a break. We might need a break after it.
Yeah, they passed House Bill 2391, which I hear two different numbers, between $550 million and $605 million in new taxes on health insurance and health care and hospitals. And it breaks down in a number of different ways, but the really ugly part of it was that they authorized a 1.5% tax on premiums that those of us in the private sector pay, that people in the exchanges pay, that people in coordinated care organizations pay, and that Public Employee Benefit Board health benefits pay. So those public employees will see their premiums go up 1.5%, but the taxpayers pay that. And that portion of it, plus a small new hospital tax, is an increase of about $333 million. And several legislators who oppose that bill have filed a referendum to allow Oregonians to say, do you really want a specific tax on your health insurance premiums? And they even went to the extent of saying that the private insurance companies are allowed, encouraged, in effect, to pass that premium tax on to their policyholders. normally, if there's an additional cost that a health insurance company has, they have to go to the state and get approval to raise their rates. In this case, the government's giving them prior approval, saying, we're taxing you 1.5%, you go ahead and pass it on to your ratepayers. So how do we make insurance less expensive by increasing the government cost on that insurance? We think that's a really bad idea.
Yeah, good question.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are not a whole lot of people that have followed that closely and realize some taxes do trickle down, and
this doesn't even trickle. This just the government says you put it on those people's bills. So
include it.
The only people that won't get hit by it really are Medicaid and Medicare recipients, which is a large number, but everybody else is going to see their premiums go up 1.5% just because of this new tax.
So that will affect the small group market and the large group commercial market.
Self-insured, I don't think are covered by it. It's a big bill. I'm not sure of all the details, but so I think actually big companies and big unions actually can get out of it. It's the small guy.
Okay.
It's most of us, the people who work in average companies in Oregon, or are self-employed and buy their own insurance, or on the ACA exchanges will all be hit by it.
Yep.
So
we need
there will be a referendum if they collect 59,000 signatures by, I think it's October 4th or October 8th. It'll be on the ballot, and normally it would be on next November's ballot, 2018, but the legislature also passed another bill that moves the election up to January, which will cost us another $3.3 million in cost for a special election.
Well, we've got to take a break, but we'd love it if you'd stay on the line and
Sure.
we want to talk a little bit about how you prepare for the short session coming up, which will be here before we know it.
Right.
So we'll just take a break for a couple minutes and we'll be back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Welcome back. This is Legislative Matters, and we've got Steve Buckstein with the Cascade Policy Institute today, who's certainly given us some insight into some of the education and healthcare tax bills. And now we'd like to move into the 79th session just ended, the long session, and now we're in an interim session. And Steve, what do you do during the interim? February will be here before we know it, and there will be a 6-week short session, I think. How do you and the Cascade Policy Institute, and quite frankly others, prepare during the interim, and what do you expect to see come up in the short session?
Well, supposedly the rationale for these short sessions was to deal with smaller issues, not major policy changes. But again, you can't stop a legislature or an interest group from submitting anything they want and either dealing with it or not. And I think what's going to happen in this next session, a couple things that we're looking at. One is that if this referendum we just talked about to refer the $333 million in taxes on our health insurance, if that makes it to the ballot, and if the election is in January, then the legislature is going to be dealing with that in February. If the voters say no, we don't want you to tax our health insurance, then there's going to be a quote-unquote hole in the health care funding. From our standpoint, a big part of the budget deficit in the first place in this just past session was Medicaid, the Medicaid expansion, which some states got on board with, including Oregon, and others didn't. We think that expansion is a bad idea, that it actually, while it has insured more Oregonians under Medicaid, many of them, we believe, are not eligible for that insurance, and some of them are actually dropping private insurance to get the free health care from the public. So we would welcome that referendum being approved and the legislature having to say, well, gee, we really can't cover all these people. We've got to look at doing something differently. They passed a bill to cover all kids, as they called it. So every child in Oregon who's in a family with less than 300% above the poverty rate would get free health insurance from the state. That is unaffordable. So I think they'll be addressing those things. The other thing is that public employee unions are looking to put measures on the ballot next November 2018, for big tax increases. And so if they get those signatures or are close to it by the legislative session in February, the legislature may again take a look at trying to come up with their own tax increase and basically derail a much more damaging one from our standpoint that may be on the ballot in November 2018. So there could be some big things being looked at in February.
Well, given that uncertainty is generally bad for most everything, I guess I'm not understanding the negative aspect of having the ballot measure in January. I mean, understanding the cost of a special election, I get that, versus November, but at least we'd know sooner rather than later.
Well, yes, there's arguments on both sides. I'm not so upset about that part of it, but in that same bill, I think it was Senate Bill 229, they moved the election from November up to January, but they also derailed, or as the Oregonian editorial put it, hijacked the referendum process. Normally, if the people collecting signatures get the signatures, the Attorney General of the state would write a ballot title, and all of us, you and I and everyone, would be able to comment on that in an open process, and the Supreme Court could tell the Attorney General, it's okay, you did it right, or go back and rewrite it. But under this bill that the legislature passed, not only moving the election to January, they also said that we're going to take this ballot title and what you see in your voter's pamphlet text away from the Attorney General, and we're going to do it ourselves. We're going to appoint 4 Democrats and 2 Republicans. Now, obviously, the Democrats have the majority in both houses, but that is quite a stretch. So that turns it into a partisan game, basically, so that the people that get to write the ballot title and that get to give you the explanation and that get to fill up your voter's pamphlet are the people that want the taxes in the first place. They're not a neutral, objective third party. And that could be very bad for the initiative and referendum process. And that alone, I think, is a reason to oppose that bill, which required the early election and as the Oregonian said, hijack the referendum process.
Well, that is a good segue into our last and final question, because our time's running out and we could go for another hour, I think. But so our listening audience, so as they get ready for the session coming up, and we hope they tune in when we come back for that session, what should the public do? And I was on your website, and you've got some great recommendations for being involved. But in the next 6 months, what are the things that the regular citizenry like us do to get ready for the short session and get engaged?
Well, I'd like to think, and you'd like to think, that people that listen to your show and the people that read our articles on our website are engaged. We help them be engaged by making it easy for them to contact their legislators. There are pages at the legislative website where you can find out, just putting in your address or your zip code, who your legislators are, and then you can contact them. But the reality is that most people have busy lives, and they're not going to be involved. They're going to go on with their lives. They're going to be happy that the 79th session is over, and so they can't do any more harm to them, and they're not going to think about it until the legislature comes back in session in February. And so for the bulk of Oregonians, I think what they need to realize when politicians tell them what they've done for them is not to accept it at face value. For example, one of the bills that we think was a good idea that it died was the bill that would raise taxes on small businesses back up from 7 to 9%. If you recall, the so-called Grand Bargain in 2013 lowered the tax rate for many small businesses. But the legislature in this session, because they needed so much money, they said, well, if you have fewer than 10 employees, we're going to raise your rate back from 7 up to 9%. Luckily, that didn't pass, but it very well could have, and the average small business owner would have no idea until he saw his tax rate go up. So you should be engaged. You should be aware of what's going on, but the reality is that most people get blindsided, and that's what I think the legislature and a lot of special interest groups count on, that it's too late for them to object once they see these bills coming at them. So it's our job at Cascade Policy Institute and other groups that are sort of watchdogs to bring these things to people's attention. So the thing I would say for your listeners is go to cascadepolicy.org, our website. You can sign up for our weekly courier email so that it's free, and you see what's coming out, you see our concerns, and you might not agree with us, but at least you'll see what we think is important leading up to the February session.
Well, very good. We've run out of time, but Steve, I can't thank you enough. And this program will be podcast, so people can download it anytime and hear it. But thank you so much for your insight and assessment of the session and preparing our listeners for what's to come next. And good luck with the short session coming up. And congratulations on ending the long session.
Thank you,
with
Jen.
some
I
wins
enjoyed being with you. We'll promote the podcast too and let people hear the whole interview.
Well, great. Thank you so much, and hopefully we'll have you back.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye. So, interesting interview with Steve. They are very, very engaged. Their website is full of information, and as he said, it's cascadepolicy.org, and there's lots of information from there. They've given a lot of testimony to the legislature, and clearly they have a perspective, and a little bit different than the perspective we heard last week. So, with that, Jan, are there any more governor bills bills signed by the governor that you wanted to include?
There are a couple.
Okay. And then I want to ask you about your assessment of the session.
Well, there's a very confusing one. Well, I might not even do that one. It's just too confusing to explain to our listeners because I can't explain it quite right. But the House Bill 2262, which was signed by the governor, allows Employment Relations Board to employ and set salaries for personnel who are management service employees or unclassified state employees. So they've switched who's doing that. So Employment Relations Board is now employing and setting salaries for those particular two areas. That takes effect January 1st, 2018. House Bill 5028 limits certain biennial expenditures from fees, monies, and other revenues, and including miscellaneous receipts, which is big, miscellaneous receipts, but excluding lottery funds and federal funds collected by and received by the state parks and recreation department. So it's another one of these, how they're going to be funded, what they can do, what they can't do. This one's House Bill 2503 allows Health Licensing Office to issue lactation consultant licenses to qualified applicants. This was just new to me. Requires lactation consultants to complete cultural competency and trauma-informed care continuing education courses.
Interesting.
Everybody's got to know more and do more if they're going to do what they do. And so that is effective June 29th, or was effective. It's there now. So
okay. All right.
That's it.
With that, now my favorite part. So this is the end of our inaugural year. We hope to be back for the short session in February. But I am curious, Jan, you've been involved in state government for a long time, certainly been involved in the legislative process. What did you find the most interesting given this session?
The most interesting?
The
very most interesting is how very difficult it was to get the 13 area Mid-Willamette Valley legislators to appear on our show. And I know they're extremely busy. And we had some wonderful people, too, that did appear. We had Paul Evans. We had
Jody
Hack and Peter Courtney.
Yeah.
The rest, I tried. Lots of different people. And we will try again.
We'll keep trying.
We'll keep trying because we really think it's important that people listening to our show anyway know what their legislators are, how they're thinking, what they're doing, what they're happy about, etc. So that was my biggest surprise, I guess, because I'm the one that tries to get them on the show. And I was very pleased that we were able to go into some different areas, such as Cascade Policy Institute and the Center for Public Policy, and League of Women Voters, some other groups that it was good to hear from and their take on the legislature.
Well,
how about you, kiddo?
I've learned a lot. I am just continually surprised about how few public members, citizens, are involved in the process. So that's what Legislative Matters is about, is to try and certainly inform and get inform listeners and increase engagement in the process. So with that, we've run out of time today, and Jan and I are going to take a break just like the legislators did, and we may be back a little bit in the interim, but we promise to be back early next year in time for the special session, the short session. So thank you for joining us for Legislative Matters today and throughout the session.